All right, well, hi everyone. My name is Jamie Olson, and I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Feeding Texas. I am super excited to have you with me today to talk about advocacy. Go ahead and get started. So I wanted to start with what is Feeding Texas. Feeding Texas is the state association for all of the food banks in Texas. So we have 21 members that collectively cover all 254 counties. That's the map you see, as well as, or including the East Texas Food Bank, which is up there in the upper left-hand corner, right-hand corner. We have several programs that all serve our mission of leading a unified effort for a hunger-free Texas. I'm the lead of our policy and advocacy program. We also have social services, SNAP Ed, VISTA, and disaster response. So why is advocacy important? I imagine all of you work at nonprofit organizations, food pantries, and other partners of the East Texas Food Bank. And so you all have donors, right? Fundraising is a big part of what you do. Well, imagine that you had a donor, one donor, that funded 19/20ths of your annual budget. And without that one part of that donation, you would need to increase your output by 12. I bet you'd probably give that donor a lot of attention, a lot of love. You would invite them to your facility. You would send them Christmas cards. Well, you do have a donor like this, and that donor is the federal government. So food banks and private charities, that includes all of you, provide only 1 out of every 20 bags of groceries that feed people who are hungry. The federal government provides the other 19 in the form of programs like SNAP, child nutrition programs like the National School Lunch Program, the Summer Food Service Program, TFAP, which you all know well, CSFP, and others. In addition, we know that for every 1 meal that the Feeding America Network provides, so the Feeding America Network refers to all the food banks in all 50 states. The East Texas Food Bank is a member of the Feeding America Network, as well as our other 20 members here in Texas. And by extension, you guys are part of our network. So the Feeding America Network, for every 1 meal that we provide, SNAP provides 12 to hungry families. And that's just a function of the sheer magnitude and efficiency of the SNAP program. So it is super important to advocate for these programs, because we know that we cannot solve hunger alone, right? What we do is super critical and important, but without these programs, our jobs would be a whole lot harder. And I should have said this already, but feel free, y'all, to interrupt me anytime. Type a question in the chat, raise your hand, take yourself off mute. I'm just going to be talking at y'all. So feel free to chime in whenever you'd like. So who benefits from public policy? We just figured this out, right? You do, your agencies do. So TFAP and the CSFP programs, they are a huge source of food that goes into the East Texas Food Bank. It's typically about 1/3 of the food that our food banks provide to people comes from TFAP alone. And so any advocacy that results in an increase in TFAP directly benefits your organizations. Also, your clients. Your clients benefit from advocacy and from public policy as well. So in addition to TFAP, again, there's programs like SNAP, there's child nutrition programs, Medicaid, public housing, TANF. All of those programs are government programs. And so advocacy is super critical to ensuring that those programs are the most efficient, effective, and reach the most amount of people as possible. So we're going to bust some common advocacy myths with this next slide. The first one being that advocacy is illegal for nonprofits. This is absolutely 100% false. Advocacy is allowed for nonprofit organizations. You could spend 100% of your time and 100% of your resources on advocacy, and that would be allowed. The reason why I say that is because there is a critical difference between advocacy and lobbying. Advocacy is talking about issues. So you could go to your elected official and talk about hunger, food insecurity, health, nutrition, your work, what your agency does, all of that, all day, every day. And that would be completely allowed. So advocacy is broad. Advocacy is talking about programs even. You could talk about SNAP, TFAP, CSFP, child nutrition, all of that, totally allowed. Lobbying is very specific. So lobbying is when you are asking an elected official to support a specific piece of legislation. So if you ask them, vote yes on SB 224, right? And we'll talk a little bit later about other kinds of legislation. If you're asking them to vote a certain way, or if you're supporting a specific candidate that is running for office, asking folks to vote for President Biden, something like that, all of that is lobbying activities, right? And lobbying, there is a limit. Lobbying, we have limits for nonprofit organizations, and that's what the chart is on the page. So you could, it depends how big your organization is. So whether you have an annual budget of like $500,000 or $500,000 to $1 million, you see the different categories there. They have a limit on the expenses that you can have related to lobbying. So $100,000 for a $500,000 organization, that's 20%. It's still really high in terms of your expenses that they allow for lobbying. So I am a registered lobbyist in the state of Texas, but I spend very little of my time working for Feeding Texas lobbying. Most of the work that I do is considered advocacy, because when I go to a legislator or talk to a legislator's office about general issues or public programs, again, SNAP, hunger, nutrition, all of that, that's considered advocacy, and it's totally allowable. When I talk about specific pieces of legislation, that's lobbying. And that I have to track my hours and my my hours of time spent doing that, and my expenditures, if I have any, related to lobbying. And that is where there's a threshold. But I can tell you that we never at Feeding Texas, we never get anywhere close to spending anywhere near these limits. And I'm sure you wouldn't either, because again, 90% of the things that you're going to spend your time talking about is advocacy. It's general topics. Do we have any questions on this before I move on? It's just a really important point that I wanted to make sure people understand. Some of the other myths are about not wanting to get too political. Well, we live in a political society. These days, pretty much any topic is political. So trying to avoid political topics is, like trying to avoid drinking water. It's really not something that you're really able to do these days. And the last two about advocacy being confusing or difficult, and also like the fact that you wouldn't make a difference, I'm going to bust those with the next few slides. Because those are also completely false. Advocacy is super easy, and you 100% will make a difference. So let's learn more about that. So this is the results of a poll where congressional staff were asked, if your member or senator has not already arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might the following advocacy strategies have on his or her decision making? And this is a lot of different advocacy strategies on this one slide, but what I really want to show you here is that individualized communications make the biggest impact. So that's in-person visits, which I know are weird these days because of COVID, but a lot of representatives still are allowing in-person visits if you feel comfortable. But also emails and phone calls are totally effective as well, as long as it's an individualized communication coming from someone in their district. What's not as effective, I mean, it's still like 50%, so it's okay. It's not a strategy we should abandon, but not as effective are mass communication strategies. So that's like signing your name to a petition, or like when it says postcards, it means those kind of campaigns where an organization will have like 50,000 people all send the same exact postcard. Like, it's not as effective. Social media, you see, around 50 or 51%. Like I said, these aren't strategies we should abandon, but those mass communication strategies are much less effective than individual communications. So if there's one thing that I can leave you with, it's just that taking the time to make that phone call or write that email or visit your representative is going to have a huge impact. All right, state advocacy. This is Texas politics, y'all. So this is how a bill becomes a law in Texas. I'm not going to spend too much time here. If you want to learn more about it, you can join us for the advocacy boot camps. But basically, how a bill becomes a law in Texas is it's complicated, but it does have to go through both chambers. So there's the Senate and the House, and the bill has to pass with a majority vote through both sides before it gets to the governor's desk. So there's a lot of advocacy opportunities in here at every single stage of the process. We shepherd bills. That's what I do as an advocate and a lobbyist, is I just push these bills through this process whenever there's a legislative session. So what did we do this past session? Legislative session, by the way, in Texas is every other year. So the last one was 2019. We had one this year, 2021. The next one's not till 2023. The regular session is always January through May of those years. So it's a really short amount of time, only 5 months out of 24 months that we have to influence public policy in Texas. This year was a crapshoot. It was a very odd year to be an advocate in Texas. We had COVID, which, normally that time frame, January through May, the legislators don't go home. They are in Austin at the Capitol every single day. Their staff and them work very long hours every single day to get legislation passed. Because of COVID, the legislators did something called, they gavelled in, which means they just started session, and then they gavelled out 3 days later. That is insane. But the reason why they did that is that it was kind of like a test. They wanted to see if having all the legislators and their staff in the Capitol would cause a COVID outbreak. So they came there for 3 days and then went home for 3 weeks to make sure that they could safely gather in the Capitol with their COVID protocols. So that was 3 weeks where no work was getting done, which is kind of crazy at the beginning of a session. And then we lost another 3 weeks when Winter Storm Uri came, which we all experienced. That was nuts. The Capitol was shut down for a week. The second week, legislators started to trickle back into Austin. And then the third week, the only thing any of them wanted to focus on or talk about was legislation related to the electrical grid, because that is what happened during the storm. And so that was another 3 weeks effectively that we didn't have any attention on our issues. So that's 6 weeks out of 5 months that we completely lost in this legislative session. And normally, like I said, it takes pushing every single day to get a bill passed. Getting a bill passed in Texas is very hard. This was also a very highly polarized session. So there are a lot of really contentious items. There was the anti-abortion legislation, the voting rights legislation, the legislation that banned critical race theory in public schools. A lot of those were very partisan and very contentious pieces of legislation. And when you have such fighting in the Capitol on issues like that, it really sucks up all the oxygen in the room and doesn't really allow for bipartisan efforts on other legislation like ours that's maybe not so controversial. So it was very tough to get anything done this session. That being said, we had one huge success. We passed our senior SNAP bill. I started working on this bill in 2019. So in that previous session, so it's a long time coming and a lot of work. But this bill did some really great things for seniors and people with disabilities. It shortens the initial SNAP application. It waives the recertification interview, so people are only having to interview one time. And it also extends the certification from 12 months to 36 months. So people aren't having to reapply as often. And again, this is just for seniors and people with disabilities that have no earned income. So I'm very proud that we were able to pass this bill this session. It was very difficult. Shout out to anyone on this call who participated in our advocacy boot camps and lent their voice to help support this legislation. It was a team effort. Feeding Texas did not do it alone, but it is kind of the shining spot of the 2021 session in terms of hunger. So I'm very proud of it. Federal advocacy. So upcoming on the radar is something called child nutrition reauthorization. Child nutrition reauthorization, or CNR for short, is something that happens at the federal level roughly every 5 years. We're actually a little bit overdue for this round of CNR, but this is a federal package of legislation that covers all of the child nutrition programs, including CACFP, WIC for infants and mothers, the National School Lunch Program, the School Breakfast Program, and the Summer Food Service Program. So Congress is going to be tackling CNR very soon, and we're going to have a lot of advocacy opportunities at the federal level to really raise our voices about these child nutrition programs. And there are some really big priorities here, one of which is the summer EBT program. So many of y'all probably heard about PEBT or pandemic EBT, which was given to families on EBT cards when schools were closed as a supplement to help replace those meals that kids weren't getting at school. Well, we are advocating to turn PEBT into a permanent summer EBT program, which will drastically reduce childhood hunger in the summertime when we know it spikes because kids aren't getting their regular meals at school. Right now, the Summer Food Service Program, y'all probably are aware, there's a congregate feeding requirement. It's been suspended because of the pandemic, but pre-pandemic, kids had to congregate at community sites in order to get fed. And that's very challenging, especially in rural areas where transportation is limited. A lot of times if their parents are at work, it's like, how are they going to get to these sites? And so we are trying to advocate for a permanent summer EBT program where every kid that qualifies for free or reduced price lunches at schools will get an EBT card mailed to them for the summer months to help with childhood food insecurity. So that's a big priority for us for child nutrition reauthorization. So I'm going to give y'all 5 quick and easy tips for influencing your lawmakers. This is a real quick tutorial of just how to interact with legislators and their staff. First of all, research your legislator. Know who you are talking to. It is not a good look, so to speak, for you to walk into a meeting with a legislator or their office and know nothing about that person that you're meeting with. Know their party, right? Are they Democrat? Are they Republican? You should know what area they represent. You should know what committees they're on. A big part of passing a bill in that previous slide was the fact that these bills originate in committee. So instead of, talking to the full legislature like you do when the bill is coming up for a vote, you start by just having to influence like 8 or 9 committee members. And so those members have a lot of influence over our issues. The Health and Human Services Committee is the most important in Texas to our priorities because the Health and Human Services Committee governs SNAP and child nutrition and all of the kind of health and hunger related issues. So if you have a legislator from East Texas that's on that Health and Human Services Committee, either in the Senate or the House, they're a really important legislator, and I know you do, so we're gonna get to that later. But yeah, know who you're talking to is very important. Number 2, be your own expert. This is like all about having confidence. I want to impress upon you that you do not need some fancy degree or something like that to be an expert on hunger and food insecurity. You already are, right? You work every day feeding people, and that makes you an expert. that is the experience and the knowledge that you should be sharing with your legislators, because they are not experts. Legislators and their staff have to know a little bit about a million topics because they get bills dealing with so many different things. You are the expert about hunger in their community, and that's how you should present yourself. Rule number 3, communicate frequently. So this is all about having a relationship with legislators, or honestly, more importantly, their staff. Legislative staff are very important. So if you request a meeting and you don't get to meet with that senator himself or herself, and instead you end up talking to their staff person, please don't be discouraged. 9 times out of 10, I am meeting with staff, and they are almost more important because that staff person is the person that that legislator depends on to know these issues so that they are getting accurate information when it comes time to vote on bills. So talking to staff is not a bad thing. And this rule is about having a relationship. So if you have a friend in your life and the only time that friend calls you is if they need something, are you gonna like that friend? Like, do you think they're a very good friend? No, right? So you shouldn't wait until you need something to talk to your legislator's office. Introduce yourself early and communicate often. How often is often? I would say like quarterly, every 3 or 4 months. Maybe shoot them an email or give them a phone call just to update them on what you're doing, what hunger is looking like, especially because of the pandemic. Just let them know, like, hey, we had a 20% increase in people seeking need at our food distributions over the past 3 months. You know, thought you'd like to know hunger is really spiking in your district right now. You know, that kind of stuff can be so impactful for them to know. And how are they going to know if you don't tell them? Follow up and get firm answers. So this is about making asks. Like I said in the slide before, you shouldn't start with an ask. You should start by introducing yourself and being a resource, providing them with general information, which again is all all advocacy and not lobbying. But when you do have an ask to make, be firm and ask them, instead of saying, we really hope Senator Hall will support SB 224, say, we really need Senator Hall to support SB 224. Will he vote yes? And ask them, because if you're talking to a staffer and you say, will he support this? That puts it on them to give you an answer. And if their representative is not going to support that, they're going to have to tell you that to your face and give you a reason why he's not going to support it. And that puts them in a little bit of an uncomfortable situation. And that's almost what you want to do, right? We want to demand the support of our representatives because they represent you, right? Rule number 5 is tell a personal story. So I am a data nerd. I love data. Like if someone says 80% of blah, 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 like I latch on to that. But I am not the majority of people here. I think a lot of data points like that go in one ear and out the other, especially when talking to legislators. They hear data all day. It gets very boring. Telling a personal story can have such an impact because it'll tug at those heartstrings. It'll stay in their head. They will remember you, remember the conversation that you had, And then later when they have to vote on those bills, they'll think, man, that story that Jamie told me, I just can't vote no on this anti-hunger bill because that really made an impact, you know. So tell a personal story. So that same survey, this is more questions from that same survey I showed you all before. How helpful is it for messages from constituents to include the following? And how frequently do messages from constituents include the following? So we have a specific request or ask, a constituent's reason for supporting or opposing. So that's like your personal reason. Number 3 is a personal story. And number 4 is information about the impact that the bill would have on the district. So like, how would this piece of legislation really impact the lives of people living in our community? So with the bottom 2, we see that people think this information is extremely helpful. Again, this is legislators and their staff responding to this poll. So they think that this information is really helpful, but almost no one is including this information when they communicate. So personal stories and information about the impact on the district can, this is like room for improvement for advocates. Here's where we should be focusing our efforts when we communicate. These other 2 we see still very helpful to folks, and we're doing a little bit of a better job where 59 and 50% of people include a specific ask and your reason. So keep doing that. Don't switch tactics, but also think about including a personal story or info about the impact of the bill on the district. Bonus rule, tailor your message. And this goes back to rule number 1 about knowing who you're talking to before you get in the room. When we talk about hunger, we are blessed that it is a pretty bipartisan issue. There's not a lot of people out there that are going to say, you know, screw those people, let them starve. It's not something we really hear. But where it gets a little bit more partisan is when we start talking about what the solution is to hunger. A lot of people support private charity as the answer to hunger, but as we saw at the beginning of the presentation, private charity only goes so far. We cannot solve hunger on our own. We need government intervention. We need programs like SNAP, because if we did not have those, hunger would be such a bigger problem in America. So think about who you're talking to and switch your message based on what's going to resonate with them. The difference between a Democrat and a Republican, if you're talking about SNAP, you know, could be pretty big. You know, for a Republican, you could focus more on the economic impact of SNAP, the fact that it's an economic multiplier and is going to not only help feed hungry people, but really give a boost to the local economy. You know, that's just one example of a different message that might resonate. So find your legislators. It's pretty easy. This is a map of the East Texas Food Bank service territory. And I just listed the senators and not all the representatives because there's too many to put on one slide. But you find your county, find your representative. There's also tons of websites. There's capital.texas.gov, or the Texas Tribune has a legislative directory. My TLO, which stands for Texas Legislature Online. There's even I think if you type in like who's my representative or find my representative into Google, like it'll pop up with something you can type in your zip code and it'll tell you who your representative is. Super easy to find out who represents you. And Senator Hall is on that Health and Human Services Committee. So if you are in Rains or Van Zant County, he's a very influential person on our issues that we care about. So an example of introducing yourself, because remember, we're starting early and communicating often, would just be to reach out via email or over the phone and say, hi, my name is Jamie. I'm a constituent in your district, and I understand that Senator Hall is on the Health and Human Services Committee. I'd like to help educate him on hunger in his district and how he can make a difference. So you're just educating these folks. It's very simple. You can talk about, you know, hunger or the services that you provide, and just get them that info, because like I said before, they're not going to know if you don't help them. I also mentioned our Advocacy Bootcamp series before. So East Texas Food Bank did participate in this last year, and we plan on doing some more in 2022. So these virtual advocacy boot camps are designed to teach partner agency staff, that's you, as well as food bank clients, everything they need to know to advocate effectively in Texas. So it's basically a 6-week course on what I've just been talking about today. Each week you get on Zoom for, it should say 1.5 hours a week. It's 90 minutes, 1.5 hour Zoom call every week, plus a little bit of homework. The homework is easy. It's like gonna take you less than an hour to complete. So it is a little bit of a time commitment, but I promise it's worth it. The weeks are kind of outlined there, and stay tuned in 2022 for how to sign up. And there's my contact info. So again, feel free to reach out to me if y'all need anything advocacy related. I am here to help. So do we have any questions?